we all remember Pete Seeger and little boxes made of tiki-taki. But not only that, but what happens to the people who live in them? And then, of course, Joni Mitchell with, don't know what you've got till it's gone. Imagine, remind me, Battery Square? Battery Street. Yeah. Imagine if that wasn't there. Imagine if it had been bulldozed and there was a McDonald's there. We would look back and think, what was wrong with those people 30 years ago or 20 years ago when they didn't do something to protect Battery Street? So, it's really important. It really is the heart of Oak Bay. It's where Rattenbury's house is. It's where he and T. Arks developed our first subdivision. It really is a marvelous place. And I love that there's a more recent book, 2006. De Botton wrote a book entitled The Architecture of Happiness. And when I read it, it resonated. Yes. We talk about, can you regulate taste and can you describe, of course you can. I mean, there's good architecture and bad architecture. Bad architecture makes us sad and bored and irritated, and good architecture makes us happy. And so the book's in the library. It's a marvelous book. So after ranting on about HCAs and how they're a wonderful thing and obviously the foundation, we have two mandates. One is to give money away, which I'm totally inept at apparently, because I can't give money away. So if anyone needs money, just see me afterwards. Don't mention that to the mayor because he may fire me for being totally inept. The second mandate of the foundation is to promote heritage. And what better way of promoting heritage than to give our support behind an HCA for this wonderful part of Oak Bay. So it's our real pleasure now to introduce our two speakers. Stuart Stark probably doesn't need much of an introduction. He's been a fixture in the heritage scene for 35 years, mainly Oak Bay, Victoria. He rescued a house from demolition in the 80s. And that's one of those houses on Hampshire that you look at and you think, well, how could anyone have demolished this landmark? He was responsible for this wonderful renovation. We now have a landmark in Oak Bay from the 1890s that he saved. Apparently he did the same in Victoria as well. And of course, he wrote the most popular book in Oak Bay. Right? Everybody wants this book. I was fortunate, I found this. I've been here 5 years. About a month after I arrived, I found this book in a store, and Janet and I spent the next several months walking around Oak Bay, reading the book, and it brought Oak Bay to life. We could see the history of where we were. So we're really pleased to have Stuart Stark as our first speaker. And of course, Stuart used to live on Prospect Place. As a young person, that's where he grew up. So he was Oak Bay's favorite person, but a few years ago he moved to Saanich. So, but there we are, what can you do? So our next speaker, Michael Prince, well known from University of Victoria, writes on all kinds of fascinating things. Google him, got just a fascinating background, very interesting. Took his PhD at Exeter, and when he was there, lived in an 18th century cottage garret. And apparently there was a plaque on the wall stating that Charles Dickens' father was exiled there by Charles Dickens to get him out of London because he couldn't afford to pay his debts all this time. And of course, Michael and Karen live in a 1908 Rattenbury designed house on Prospect Place. I mean, can you get any more Oak Bay than that? So it's my pleasure. And what we're going to do is Stuart will go first. Secondly, Michael. We won't have any questions during the presentation. At the end of it, we'll have a question and answer period, and then we'll wrap up and have tea and biscuits. So on behalf of the Foundation and the Commission, please welcome officially Stuart and Michael.
Hello, I'm Stuart Stark. I'm going first with the main presentation. I want to thank, how I got here, first of all, is I had been invited by the Protect Oak Bay Heritage Group who are proposing this, and they said, since you're a heritage consultant and you happen to grow up in the area, you probably know something about it. Could you please come and do a walking tour? So I've done 2 walking tours, and then Rick Marshall from this group came along and said, on one of the walking tours, and said, could you make that into a lecture, please? So I said, okay, I can do that too. So it's been, sorry, my laser pointer is not here. And I'm gonna need it. No. Did it by Braille. So using, this is sort of a combination, as an outsider to the group, I've used my wearing 2 hats here. A person who grew up on Prospect Place, surrounded by heritage architecture, which I think has affected my life totally for the rest of my life. Yeah, I'd prefer it off if that's possible. Okay, thank you. Also as a heritage consultant looking at this as a potential heritage conservation area. And I think no place better. First of all, what is a heritage conservation area? It's a distinct district with special heritage value and character. And I think in the next, during the presentation, you will certainly pick up that it has all of that in spades. And why the Prospect? And the Prospect refers to the wonderful views to the sea, Mount Baker and the islands and the ocean that all the houses had. And if you look, this is a lovely, fabulous early photograph of this tugboat from 1915. But over in the far side here is the Prospect. And what we see, and you see there's no trees. This is Clive Phillips' Woolly House on Clive Drive, which has been demolished. This is Erin, designed by Samuel McClure for Thomas Gore. This is Garrison House, which was one of a pair. That little house is a house, I believe, by T. Arks. This is one by Rattenbury that Mike lives in. And a couple more down here, but you can see they all had views. And these are historic views of the Prospect. Now, the top 2 are brand new historic photographs I've just been sent, which is terrific. This is actually Mike Prince's house, designed by Rattenbury, but you can see the ocean down here. This little fellow is one of the Peters boys from Garrison House, and the ocean is behind, and yet he's standing on the property on York Place. This is Briarbrae by Rattenbury, also on York Place, and you can see the ocean back in behind. And this is from Bidewee by McClure on Beach Drive with the wonderful ocean, and you would have seen Mount Baker right here. So that's why the name, the Prospect. First subdivision of Oak Bay, we've all seen this before, but what we're doing is focusing on this little bit of Joseph Pemberton's property down here by the water, overlooking Mary Todd Island, and of course where we are today. Oldest house in Western Canada, Todd House, built 1850-51, and that is right up here. You always wondered why Todd Road was on an angle off of Cadbury Bay Road. Well, it was because the house faced if you draw a line through Cadbury Bay Road, that leads right across the front of Todd House. This is an unusual map. Most people don't know about it. It's the 1883 military map, and it is the area that we're showing here. It's a great map because it shows vegetation, and it shows that the area that we're talking about was sparsely vegetated, while there was more of a forest down south. We've got Todd House up here, there's Todd Road and Cadbury Bay Road here. The Willows Hotel, 1860s, and the Cazenave residence, which is underneath the giant redwood tree at Oak Bay High School. In 1891, big changes came to Oak Bay, and residents and development started to be introduced to this special place. And it's amazing that Mount Baker features in everything. That's when Oak Harbor came up with their development plans. And Oak Harbor, private company, bought a lot of land, started to develop it. They kept this area down here, which is near the marina at the moment, for a hotel reserve. This area was meant to be developed, but it became Windsor Park, but at first was called Oak Bay Park. The streetcar was put in all the way down here to Oak Bay Park in 1891. And if you notice the names of the streets, Long Branch, Saratoga, Brighton, Margate, Deal, Newport, and they were all resorts. This was set up to be the Western Canadian big resort. Now, the area that we're going to be talking about is this area right here on Prospect Street, as they called it, and this street all the way around the edge was called Mount Baker Avenue. Development was made possible because of the streetcar, and the streetcar came in 1891, and I love this quote here, "Hurry up or the tramway will be ahead of you," as by their agreement they must be in operation by July 4th, 1891. 1891 was also when the Mount Baker Hotel was built. Branch. It was the best on the continent. It was being compared with Cliff House in San Francisco. And 285-foot long front porch where you could idle away the time and be served tea and watch the steamers go by. There also was a viewing platform up on the roof where you could climb up to the tower and then go out on the roof and watch for the ships. There were archery, there were boat houses, there was a bandstand, and there was also a saloon in a pavilion. And of course, even though there were only 3 residents in all of Oak Bay at that point, there were protests about the saloon. It's interesting also to note that, and I'll just throw this in, it was the Mount Baker Hotel that the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York came to visit, and it became their residence during their visit in 1891 when they came to open the provincial exhibition. At that point, in Windsor Park, then called Oak Bay Park, they set up the Royal Stables, and they had 75 horses for their entourage. And they built brand new stables for this short visit. At that point, you got Saratoga Avenue being renamed Windsor Road. You got Windsor Park being named because of the royal connection. So it's kind of fun to have that little bit of history. And of course, in 1891, this building was built. It was the tallest, the largest building ever built in Greater Victoria at that point. It was bigger than City Hall. It was bigger than the Jewel Block. It was bigger than almost anything. It was taller. The flagpole and the tower was taller than City Hall's. And it was built in 1891 for the BC Agricultural Association, and it survived until December 1907 when it burnt to the ground, and with flames that could be seen from Seattle. And I'm going to be doing a lecture on this for the Heritage Foundation in October. But I wanted to show you, we've got, at one side you've got the agricultural exhibition building, on the other side you've got the Hotel Mount Baker. And so things were happening in Oak Bay. At that point, Oak Bay started to be a good residential district. And here's Clive Phillips' Woolly House, one of the first in the area on Clive Drive. It's since been demolished. This is the house that my wife and I saved from demolition and restored on Hampshire Road, and we got it designated heritage. This is a little cottage by T-Arcs further up Oak Bay Avenue. And this quotation, several fine homes will be in the course of erection by the 1st of the month. This is at the bottom of Beresford Avenue and Beach Drive. And you can see these two houses being built, and this is a very rare picture because most people don't take pictures of houses being under construction. But it's balloon frame architecture with one stud from the floor right to the top, which meant they were a little shaky in the wind. And it was a fashion that went out quite soon afterwards. But they said several fine houses will be in the course of erection by the first of the month. By 1892, there might have been maybe 3 residents in the area. It took a while for people to get involved in the municipality. 1898, the partnership between John Gerhard Tiarks and Francis Rattenbury, and both cutesters in their little wing collars. Both architects, both opinionated, both exactly the same age, and Rattenbury had, in 1893, a couple of years earlier, had won the winning drawing for the Parliament buildings, having just arrived from England, and he won with the pseudonym of BC Architect, which the judges thought was a really good idea to have a BC architect. And then they found out they had a 25-year-old English guy. And Tiarks had also put in a competition drawing with Rattenbury, but Rattenbury's won. They got together thinking very similarly about how to establish something very unique and very special. And what they did is they bought 15 acres, which includes this area, but their property also went further up the hill. So this is Mount Baker Avenue, later became Beach Drive, Oak Bay Avenue, which is now stairs in between, and Prospect Street. This is Rattenbury's own plan. And if you look very carefully at the layout of Prospect Street at that point, it's got this weird curve in it. And then here, and then there's a little curve taken off the corner here, and then it comes down here, and it went right into Rattenbury's driveway because he took over all this oceanfront property for himself. So essentially what he did is he built a driveway for himself, all carefully planned. Now you also see that he's straightened out Mount Baker Avenue. He took this corner off. He took some property off here, giving him a bit more property here on the waterfront. Really clever fellow at that point. The other thing he did, you notice this very skinny 2 lots down here. This was known as Beach Lane. Wasn't on the original plans of the Oak Park subdivision. This was put through on Rattenbury's plan. Why did he do that? He did that because all these properties oriented towards the beach. So these houses back here would have a pass-through to get down to what became known as Rattenbury's Beach, and is still known as that. All these houses, one of these houses has a lane through it. All these houses, some of them had sleeping porches overlooking this direction, but everything here, because of the views, was all oriented towards Mount Baker and the ocean. And this is Rattenbury's plan of his own house. So you would come down here, and gosh, right in his driveway. He had a stable. This is a 1912 plan. He had a garage here, stable here, chickens and pigeons, a greenhouse, rockery. He had a boathouse. Now, of these property, in 1914, this stable was removed and rebuilt with the current coach house that's there with chauffeurs' quarters above. And he also had a tennis court, so notice that. So the new coach house, the house, and the boathouse are all designated heritage buildings in Oak Bay. He also purchased Mary Todd Island in about 1906, and in 1929 donated it to Oak Bay for a park. He purchased it because he was afraid somebody would build a house or a fish canning plant out there. And in his greenhouse, he raised plants to plant out there to make it full of vegetation. This was his house. This is the first part of the house, built in 1898, right after he got married. Here he is lounging on the porch. And his own home at Oak Bay is one of the most charming country residences to be found in the entire West. You keep seeing his house being shown on tourist brochures and promotional brochures for Victoria, saying things like, A typical house in Oak Bay, or a typical Victoria house. And I keep thinking, yeah, sure, right. But it's still there, which is quite magical. So what we're looking at, like the proposed all good conservation areas, it's formed of both public and private spaces. Boulevards, parks, trees, foreshore and private houses, structures and gardens. There's the original plan of from the Oak Park subdivision, and which stops about here. And we know that T-Arcs own property back here. We know that other property up here was built by T-Arcs. So the subdivision, or sorry, the outline of the proposed heritage conservation area is out here. And hopefully will include the 3 designated buildings at Glen Lyon. Why establish a heritage conservation area? Well, if you go to Haynes Park, which is at the little park at the bottom of Oak Bay Avenue, and you look south, this is what you see. This is it in 1900. This is it in 2017. Now, this used to be the Oak Bay Hotel, later the Old Charming Inn, Lawrence Goodacre's house, a couple of big mansions. Samuel McClure, architect's own house, was about here, and the Marine Chalet Apartments. This had significant heritage buildings. And part of the problem with what happened here is the decision was made to zone it for this. This is why it looks the way it does today. If you look, turn in this exactly the same location and look north, you see this. It's essentially unchanged. It essentially has a natural foreshore. It has full of heritage houses. Now, that's not saying that it hasn't had development proposals. Early on, there was a development to put a big hotel here between Beach Drive and Prospect Place. When Rattenbury left his property in 1935, went to England, and I'll tell more about that in a little bit. In 1935, his own house was supposed to be turned into a hotel called the St. George and Dragon. That didn't happen. In the 1960s, because I grew up in this area, on Prospect Place, just in behind these houses, there was a proposal for a 3-story apartment building. And I remember the developers coming to my parents' house as they were going to all the neighbors saying, we want to build this, won't this be wonderful? We will then make sure that Prospect Place is paved and sidewalked, and we'll take that nasty little bump out of it and we'll widen it and curve it right up to Oak Bay Avenue, and won't it be terrific? My parents and all their neighbors were dead against that change happening in the 1960s, and they fought against it. The interesting part about that is, as they were fighting, not knowing which way it was going to go, not knowing which way council was going to go, maintenance stopped on all their houses. They didn't re-roof, because why bother re-roofing if it's going to be demolished if this development goes on further down the street? The gardens started being let to sort of go, because why bother planting new trees or doing a flower bed if it's all going to go anyway? So it took some time until Oak Bay finally said, no, we're not going to rezone, and the developers went away. And it's because of that sort of attitude and protectiveness of this area that it still manages to survive and look the way it does on the bottom slide. So how does heritage survive? Well, I've just explained that some people take it into their own to protect their neighborhood. I think this is a wonderful example, this tiny little lich gate at the corner of York Place and Oak Bay Avenue. And it was the lich gate of Erin, which was the big, huge house built by McClure for Thomas Gore up on the hill. First one is the alleged danger to traffic at the corner of Oak Bay Avenue and York Place is not caused by my lich gate or hedge or anything else on my property, but by the abnormal location of the railway tracks of the BC Electric Railway at Oak Bay Avenue. And the lich gate must not be removed or in any way harmed, and the hedge must not be removed. Now, it helped that the fellow who wrote this was a judge, and probably Oak Bay sort of took 2 steps back at that point. But that's the lich gate, and that's Oak Bay Avenue, and the streetcar tracks came right down beside this curb, and they didn't like it very much. However, the lich gate survived. because he stood up for it and said it's important. Then the landscape got subdivided, and 2 houses were built back here in probably the late 30s or 40s. Later on, somebody wanted to build an apartment building. Those 2 houses got lifted and moved, and one of them went to the corner of Hampshire and Cranmore, where they're replacing an old Sunday school. The other one went somewhere south in Oak Bay, and I can't remember where. And then an apartment building got built. And this lich gate still survives. 3 different developments. So just using that as an example, you can apply it to houses, you can apply it to stone walls, you can apply it to parks, you can apply it to all sorts of things. But that's how it survives, sometimes by luck, but usually a determined effort. The architects of the prospect. No other Oak Bay neighborhood has such a concentration of houses designed by name architects. And 11 of Oak Bay's 30 designated buildings are found within the borders of the prospect. 30 years ago, I wrote the book Oak Bay's Heritage Buildings. 30 years ago, 31 years ago. And at that point, we listed 250 houses of importance. 31 years later, we have 30 designated buildings. That's 1 a year. And since that time, a lot of them have been moved away. But the concentration in moved or demolished. But the concentration in this small neighborhood of designated heritage buildings and future important buildings of heritage or that warrant heritage protection. It's unique in the municipality. So the architecture of the prospect, there's 57 houses plus a couple of incidental building structures, carriage houses, and what we've got, first of all, because Rattenbury and Tearcs wanted to develop this as a very, very special area. They wanted to develop this as a neighborhood that it was beautiful, that was unique, that was special, not just a normal sort of subdivision. So this is the plans for this house, Sandhurst on Beach Drive. This is another Tearcs house on Prospect where they wanted to build a 3-story apartment building. This is a brand new old photograph of Garrison House up on York Place, and this is Rattenbury's own house. So they took over for the first time in the late 1890s. 1900s, we got McClure, Rattenbury, Day, Rattenbury. 1910s, we got bigger houses. We got the Morris House by James and James. We got the Gibson House, designed by McClure mostly, but Rattenbury had his hand in that. We also got additions, Rattenbury's own coach house, and we got the Tudor additions down at the end facing the ocean and Rattenbury's own house. 1920s, McClure got into it even more so. We've got Bide Wee on Beach Drive by McClure, corner of Oak Bay Avenue and Prospect by McClure, and then we have a house by Spurgeon on Beach Drive, a little patio court by Spurgeon, and another house up by Spurgeon on Oak Bay Avenue. P.L. James, and then we started getting into builders' houses, and that house, which I grew up in, 1940. With later additions, but the later additions were done by one of the best modernist architects in Oak Bay, John Wade. And John Wade lived in this house. So he built modern houses, but he lived in a McClure overlooking the ocean. In the 1970s, 80s, and there's only one house built in the 1960s. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, most of the houses that were built in the neighborhood were fill-in houses in bigger lots. Most of them fit in pretty darn well. They were traditional, and it was important that they fit in. They don't glare too much. There's a couple that are sort of a little modern if you look too closely, but we had no houses built for the last 17 years in the year 2000. So I could bore you silly with more architecture, but I think the history is important. You can call them stories, but it's really history. We've got political families, love, murder, and suicide, the sinking of the Titanic, and horses to automobiles, the transformation of an entire neighborhood. Nowhere else in Oak Bay is this story told as well as in this neighborhood, from horses to automobiles. This was very common. People would take the horses. This is actually a picture taken on North Road, which is Hampshire Road. But you can see here, stable for sale to be moved from the corner of Oak Bay Avenue and York Place, applied to T.S. Gore. So he was moving it from his property called Erin. Horseshoes still at Annandale on this wonderful carriage house that survived from 1898, designed by T. Arks in the Queen Anne style. 2 Queen Anne windows upstairs. You can still see the ocean from these 2 windows. And Rattenbury's coach house, so you go from horses to cars from 1898 to 1914. And this magnificent house, which is still there, the J.W. Morris residence by brother architects Percy Leonard James and Douglas James, built in 1912. Morris built this house on the profits of selling cars. He was the Wood Motor Company downtown. This is the cars that he sold. And look at that, it's almost identical. So whether Rattenbury just popped across to see his good friend, because there was a lot of interaction in these houses. There was social interaction, business interaction, and if you do the research on it, it's amazing. They must have been in and out of each other's houses on a frequent basis. Rattenbury's own house has a lot of stories, and that's his house, built in 1898 with the 1912 additions down here. That's the 1912 edition. Oak Bay started in 1906. Rattenbury was on the first council. He was on the Beauty Committee, it was called the Beauty Committee. It was actually, he was involved in planting trees and establishing the boulevards. And from his dining room, right over here, and there's his dining room. From his dining room window, you could see Mount Baker. And Rattenbury, drew the first crest of Oak Bay. So the history there is quite remarkable. It was changed some years ago because people thought, why do we have an American mountain on on a Canadian municipality insignia? And so instead, now we have a completely mythical sea creature. So go figure which one makes the difference. This is supposed to be Oak Bay, and Oak Bay with the boats in front, but you had to put the background in. And the other thing that's interesting is the kitchen lined with marble and the dining room fireplace, both of which are, if you look closely at receipts and things, sort of fell off the back of a truck from Rattenbury's commission at Government House. And he was saying it's all paperwork, you understand, and things do get confused, and isn't that a shame? But this is inch-thick marble lining the kitchen and pantry of his own house. And there's more interesting tales. Rattenbury now, 1912, when he became Reeve of Oak Bay, now called Mayor, in 1912. He got back, and I want to read the quotation because it's an important one. His quotation on why he ran for council. I think that the Oak Bay district is one of the most lovely residential areas that I have ever seen, and it is my desire to retain this beauty as far as possible, and the hope that I can do so is my only reason for being candidate at the coming election for Reeve. And guess what? He got elected, and people have been saying that ever since. Almost exactly the same words. So, 1912, this is him as Reeve of Oak Bay. This is Flory, his first wife, who he married in 1898, daughter of a boarding house keeper in Victoria, not well placed, no money, and they had their first child 7 months later. By 1922, 1925, 1923, he had built the Empress Hotel, he had built the Parliament buildings, he has his own house, the best country house in all of the West. He has built huge buildings, courthouses, and hotels up in the Rockies on for the CPR. He is celebrating in the ballroom of the Empress Hotel through these doors. He is celebrating the passing of the Victoria's Amusement Centre bylaw, which eventually established the Crystal Garden, which of course he got the contract for. So they're celebrating great, boozy, wonderful, aren't you terrific kind of dinner. He comes out of these doors into the lobby where Alma Pakenham is playing the piano. He is entranced and bewitched. They start going out together. He's still married to Florrie. So in their own house, and my grandmother and my mother would go to tea at Rattenbury's house in the late 20s. So he's carrying on with her while Florrie has a sick headache and is going upstairs and is lying down. Messages are being passed back and forth between Florrie and Ratz's daughter, Mary. So she's going back and forth, and Florrie's upstairs saying, "Can you please tell them to be quieter, playing the piano downstairs and making so much noise?" And this message is dutifully carried downstairs, where Alma decides to play the funeral march in fortissimo. Things go downhill from there. So they get, Florrie leaves. There is an agreement that Florrie will get her own house. If you leave, I'll build you your own house, or I'll pay for it. She could have a house anywhere in Victoria, and she chooses to have McClure design her house on Prospect Place overlooking Rattenbury's house. That's 1925. By 1929, Florrie passes away, and Rattenbury and Alma leave town for England. By 1929, that year, stock market crash. All his investments go pear-shaped. Rattenbury, not looking like the big catch that he was earlier, and Alma move into this basically tiny cottage called the Villa Madeira on Manor Road in Bournemouth. Rattenbury's 68. Alma is 38. The chauffeur is 18. Alma takes up with the chauffeur. Chauffeur, jealous of Rattenbury, who is in an alcoholic stupor and really, really poor at this point, the chauffeur bludgeons Rattenbury to death with a mallet. Alma is horrified and takes responsibility for the death. It gets worse from that, and eventually she breaks. It's found out that Stoner, the chauffeur, the 18-year-old chauffeur, he gets hauled up and sent to prison. Alma, is bereft of what she's caused. She goes and commits suicide on the bank of a river in 3 miles outside of Bournemouth. And the whole thing is made into a play by Terence Rattigan called Cause Célèbre. What a come down from all of this to this little mingy house in Bournemouth and a murder. So, onto something slightly perkier. The powerful political families that lived in this area and the political connections and the social connections are without par. We've got two fathers of Confederation to talk about: a Prime Minister, a PEI Premier, Edgar Dewdney, Lieutenant Governor of BC. In the 1890s, Frederick Peters and Sir Charles Hibbert Tupper both worked on the Bering Sea Claims Commission, and he was the Premier of Prince Edward Island. They got on really well. Sir Charles Hibbert Tupper he was the Minister of Marine Fisheries, so he worked for the federal government. They both decided to move to British Columbia because that's where all the future was. So they moved and built these two houses. In Rattenbury's own album, they're called the Bungalows. Garrison House and behind the Tupper home called Annandale. These are immense houses. The footprint is 50 feet by 100 feet. That's just the footprint. That is bigger than most, or the same size as most city lots in Oak Bay. Both designed by T-Arcs, and this is fun. The local news, holding its value. Honorable Fred Peters yesterday purchased from Mr. Gerhard T-Arcs 2 acres of land for the sum of $3,000. Anybody get their credit card out? So he is ensconced with his family in Annandale. Peters is ensconced with his family here. His father, Sir Charles Tupper, father of Confederation, Prime Minister of Canada in 1896, now in the opposition, comes on a lecture tour in 1899. In Winnipeg, Lady Tupper has a really bad accident with her carriage and is hurt. Sir Charles and his wife, Lady Tupper, they get in the CPR and they come to Vancouver. Without telling anybody or sending a telegram, they show up at Sir Charles Hibbert, their son's house in Vancouver in the West End. He also had the house here. So all of them come back to Victoria for Christmas of 1899. Lady Tupper is recovering. Sir Charles Tupper is doing speeches. He's 78 years old at this point. He is still making 2 to 4 hour political speeches that are incredibly well attended. He also has been to British Columbia lots of times. And he was the High Commissioner in London for the Fisheries Ministry, I believe. And he was the sponsor of Victoria and British Columbia and Canada being exhibiting at the Colonial and Indian Exhibition and at the Antwerp Exhibition. So he was here gathering up and encouraging people to send exhibits to these two important communities. Peter's daughter, Helen, married Edgar Ted Dewdney, nephew and ward of Edgar Dewdney, Lieutenant Governor of BC. Ted Dewdney grew up at Kerry Castle because his parents had died, and Edgar Dewdney basically adopted his nephew and made him his ward. So Garrison House in Annandale, this is a new photograph of Garrison House. It's not great, but one of the very few we have of this house. This is Garrison House, and there's Annandale. So this is the view from Oak Bay Avenue, going right across here. Annandale's carriage house, right here, built by T-Arcs in 1898, still stands. And it has these wonderful stained glass windows, and it has bits of gingerbread on it, and it probably would have had finials, and it's in surprisingly good shape. And these photographs, this is Garrison House again, these photographs have all turned up in the last 2 weeks from a private collection. And it's the Peters family at Garrison House. And quite wonderful added history. And because they were a pair, you could apply this information to Annandale just as easily as you can to Garrison House, because they're both by the same architect, designed in almost identical style. This picture at the bottom is neat, and I'll refer to it later. This is Jack Peters standing at the York Place gate of Garrison House, and the picture behind it is a really rare photograph of a house by Samuel McClure up on York Place. So I'll talk about that one later. Another connection, 1621 Prospect Place. Kathleen Dunsmuir, as Mrs. Selden Humphreys, daughter of James Dunsmuir, Premier and Lieutenant Governor. They had built a house by McClure up in Lakes Road in Duncan. And then they moved down here, and they had this house built by Ralph Barrell, who did this very Spanish-style house with grillwork on the windows and the arches. This is the rear view looking over beach drive before houses were built behind it. This is the way it is now, done in a sort of creamy beige with cream trim. But a year after leaving this house, and I think again it was 1929 when they left, it's probably financial, but Kathleen, looking quite dramatic here, she put her money in to the Crimson Paradise, which was Canada's first talking picture, filmed at the Willows, and premiered at the Capitol Theatre, downtown Victoria, before it went on to New York. And Kathleen, having been the sponsor of it, she had a walk-on part. It didn't go very far at all. It was a poor photograph, or a poor film by all accounts, but all of Victoria swarmed to the pictures to see it before it left town, to actually see the results of the first talking picture. 1912, the Titanic went down, we all know that, but we had a survivor on York Place and 2 careers gone wrong, all because of the loss of that ship. We had Mabel Fortune. She was a young woman. She was traveling from Winnipeg to England with her 2 sisters, her mother, her father, and her brother. And they were shopping for trousseaux. And a couple of the daughters were engaged. Dad wasn't too happy. Maybe if we distract them with shiny objects, they might forget about them. So then they loaded up with trousseaux and things and were coming back on the Titanic, and it went down. Mabel, her mother, and her 2 sisters survived. Her father and her brother both went to the bottom. But what also happened, and Mabel Fortune will come back up in our story. She then married her jazz musician husband when she got back, and who she later divorced, and I'll catch up with that story later. But who also went down on the Titanic was Melville Hayes, the manager of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. And here's Prince Rupert, Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. So when it went down, so did Melville Hayes with the contracts in his pocket. And Rattenbury was really badly affected because Rattenbury had designed all this. This hotel, the train terminal, and the steamship terminal, turning Prince Rupert into a magical, wonderful city. When the Grand Trunk Pacific got to Prince Rupert, it was 600 miles closer to the Orient than Vancouver was. So there were huge cost savings if this was going to go ahead. But it never went ahead, and it stayed to be a frontier town like you can see up here. The other person that was affected in 1911, Frederick Peters, lawyer, former premier of Prince Edward Island, heard that this was all going to happen. And Sir Wilfrid Laurier, Prime Minister of Canada, encouraged him to take on the new post of city solicitor for Prince Rupert. And he moved to Prince Rupert expecting all this, designed by his neighbor down the street. Isn't this going to be wonderful? Isn't this going to be amazing? He probably was talking to Rattenbury. Rattenbury was showing him plans. Isn't this going to be extraordinary that you're going to be the city solicitor and seeing all this through? And it never happened. So at that point, the war came, nothing happened, economic recession in 1913-14, and Frederick Peters died in Prince Rupert in 1919. So York Place, this is where we meet Mabel Fortune back again. But let's start just a bit earlier than that. Here's the end of York Place, and you look through at this estate. And it was built in 1907, the Judge Peter Secord Lampman estate. And this is indicative of what Rattenbury said. I'm just designing a nice house for a friend of mine recently made a judge, Lampman. He's building close to us, so I'm trying to do something extra nice as I shall see it often enough. He would see this house when he came out of his driveway every single time, because the trees weren't there. And you'd look straight up San Carlos Avenue, and you would look at this facade. So he wanted to do something really nice. So there's the house. Judge Lampman lived there for 15 years, and here's his ad in the newspaper because he was selling eggs from Rhode Island Reds. In 1922, he sold, and Charlotte Armstrong, Mrs. Armstrong, purchased the property in 1922. Mabel Fortune, married, divorced, now known as Mrs. Driscoll, came and started living with Mrs. Armstrong. It seems to be Mrs. Armstrong's money that added all sorts of renovations, adding the rose garden, the swimming pool, adding this amazing 70-foot-long greenhouse aviary, adding the coach house and chauffeur's cottage. There's the greenhouse and aviary, which you would see right from York Place straight through, and other gardens and garden events. And that's the same view today, is that you would look through here and you would have seen the greenhouse. It was taken down and moved to Pender Island. There's this mosaic swimming pool, and just remember that, I'll mention that again in a moment, but there's the rose garden going through to the swimming pool, going through to the house. That would have been Rattenbury's view coming up San Carlos Avenue. McClure designed trellis work. The wellhead that McClure would have installed, now used as a fountain by the development, because in the late 1980s, all this got redeveloped for 6 or 7 new houses. And there's the chauffeur's cottage and garage as seen from Fireman's Park, and it had a driveway that went behind the present Oak Bay Fire Hall. So the York Place Enclave, we've talked about Judge Peter Secord Lampman's estate here. We're going to talk about Briarbrae, Samuel McClure's summer house, the Captain Malescott Richardson house on Woodlawn Crescent, and the Gibson house. And there's Annandale. So you can see how all of this is really close. This is an amazing, York Place is an amazing enclave. This is Briarbrae, designed by Rattenbury in 1907, 1908. It's had a couple of additions since then. It was the residence of A.T. Goward, manager of the BC Electric Railway for the streetcars. And A.T. Goward shows up again. This is when the house was first built, and they'd planted some daffodils and things. Later, this became a very formal, laid-out garden with edges and borders and things. But you can see the views from these beautiful rear terraces and porches out over Mary Todd Island and out to Mount Baker. This mentions IODE activities. These houses all at the end were stiff with charitable activities. They sponsored garden parties, they sponsored meetings, they sponsored all sorts of charitable teas. And in this particular one, I liked it because Mrs. Armstrong and Mrs. Driscoll kindly letting their garden and the adjoining garden of Mrs. Goward, which was this house, as the setting for tea. There will be many stalls and staircases, and the mosaic swimming pool in Mrs. Armstrong's garden being a great attraction for people coming. So you go to a charitable event and strip off and start swimming in the pool. I pointed on the map that this astonishing little building still survives. It is a McClure-designed rustic summer house overlooking the grass tennis court at 1590 York Place. Across the street from the Goward's house, Mr. Goward, with his partner, Mr. Folks, tennis partner, were winners of the Pacific Northwest Tennis Championship at Tacoma. So Mr. Goward, tennis champion, would have likely gone across the street with permission and used the grass tennis court below the McClure house at that point. There was also a tennis court at Rattenbury's house. There was a tennis court, you can just see the net in behind back here at Garrison House. I believe there was another one behind Kathleen Dunsmuir's house. So there was 3 definitely and maybe 4 tennis courts in this small neighborhood. And again, St. Mary's Guild will hold a party, and they're talking about games in the pool for the children, and there will also be stalls of handicraft and something in one of them. Anyway, they would be using the tennis court for some of the events. McClure outbuildings are unbelievably rare. There used to be one at Government House, which was torn down, with somebody doing a report saying, oh, it's rustic and there's no special meaning to it. And they tore it down and replaced it with a glass thing that's now being torn down. Butch Hart Gardens has one overlooking the sunken garden, but it has been altered fairly severely. And there used to be one at Hatley, a beautiful one, rectangular one overlooking the tennis court there. And there used to be one at Bowker Place, the home of John Sylvester Bowker. And there's photographs of it, and it was a rectangular house, but it wasn't a rustic one the way this is. This has amazing diamond paned doors on two sides, and it's still in unbelievably, remarkably good condition since it was built in about 1900. Shows up in the fire insurance plans of 1913. So it was built for this house, the one we saw here behind Jack Peters, up on the hill at the end of York Place. Built in 1900, so the only flat place available was down below where the tennis court could fit. In 1907, the Captain Richardson, who was private secretary to Lieutenant Governor Dewdney, another connection, they sold it in 1907. In 1912, it was moved down the hill, and you can't see it in this photograph, but there are 9 men and 1 woman trustingly standing underneath that house. So they've shifted it sideways off the hill and then dropped it down and dropped it down. And the only photograph that place that you can see both of them at the same time is from our old house on Hampshire Road. There is the replacement house, and there is the Captain Richardson's house. And it was just recently we discovered, a few of us putting our heads together, we discovered that it was designed by Samuel McClure because we found Mrs. Richardson having been applied for a water connection permit. So that's the house that replaced it in 1919. And it's the Gibson house. And the Gibsons, Rattenbury did 19 sheets of drawings for this, and then, as he was wont to do in around that time period, he would turn it over to somebody else. He turned over the Crystal Gardens to P.L. James. He turned over this house to McClure. And if you go inside this house, which is quite magnificent, you can see McClure finishing for days, including a wonderful Inglenook fireplace in the hallway. Gibson's, it was the Beaver lumber fortune. And he was delayed in building it from 1912 when the house was moved to 1919, obviously because of the First World War. But it is a landmark, and on the front of the house, across here, wonderful terrace, 90-foot long terrace overlooking the ocean and Mount Baker. So I think we've shown that the Heritage Conservation Area is a distinct district, special heritage value and character. But that special neighborhood character can disappear overnight. This is the same driveway in Oak Bay off of Hampshire Road. And this was magical. And this isn't magical. It's okay, but it's nothing special. Preserving the Heritage Conservation Area requires cooperation between the public and private partners. So the municipality in whichever district you're in, and the private homeowners and property owners in the area. So this wonderful view of Prospect Place, which people treasure, and treasured since the 1960s and even earlier because for its rural ambience, and the houses and the summer house and the stained glass windows and the stone walls, all are important, and they all add up together. All these, when you're writing a statement of significance for an area like this, you talk about where it is, and you talk about the heritage values and what they represent and the stories and all that stuff that is embodied in the area. And then you write a letter, or you write a list of character-defining elements. And character-defining elements include the landscape. They include this sort of thing. They include the stone walls. They include the trees. And it is, as I say, a partnership between public and private. So there's lots of tools, and I won't go into them there. I won't go into them at length, but as a heritage consultant, it's things that I've dealt with over the years. And you take for granted, if you drive up Rockland Avenue and you see the Biggerstaff Wilson house and you say, isn't that wonderful that it's still there? It's only wonderful because the rules and regulations swamped on this property, preventing development on the front lawn of houses in Rockland. This is really important. This was allowed to be developed, and behind this house is a row of townhouses. So it's not that people are being hard done by, it's that it is being managed. Development is being managed. And otherwise you would have 4 or 5 houses in the front of this. So there are tools that exist, tools being used, and this is one of them. This is another one that in Oak Bay that people are not aware of. And Island Road, this is an old fire insurance map, and the Jones property, and it was being subdivided. And as part of that subdivision approval, people were worried about Island Road because it abuts onto Anderson Hill Park. And when you walk up there, again, like Prospect Place, it's an incredibly rural, really pleasant place to walk or take the dog or whatever. Most people don't know that there's a covenant on that. And there's a covenant to protect the boulevard up to the stone wall that's buried in there, 15 feet on this side, and 10 feet on the private property on the other side. There's a 25-foot barrier all along here that protects this ambience. So what we're talking about in a heritage conservation area isn't anything new. These are existing tools that municipalities use all the time, and they can protect the ambience, and this is part of the public-private partnership. So you can protect public boulevards and private buffer zones. You can carefully site development so it doesn't impact on the heritage. You can do guidelines for paving and curbs or no paving and curbs. This is interesting. It's on York Place, and this is the old pattern of concrete sidewalk. And this is the new pattern of concrete sidewalk that was laid on to extend this one. This pattern was used on Windsor Road. It was used on York Place, probably a couple of other places around the municipality. Really simple thing to do. It's just you run an extra cut line down the middle of it when you're pouring it. But it adds to the heritage. Protection of trees and landscape. So there are fabulous clusters of trees. There's some significant trees. There are some, York Place has a couple, 3 or 4 sequoias, lots of oak trees. So you review and advice for new designs and protection of the foreshore landscape. A heritage conservation area can protect the foreshore on Rathberries Beach, for example, from any further development if somebody wanted to straighten the beach drive. I'm not saying this council would, I'm not saying the last councils would, because it's still there. A future council might come along and say, let's straighten it out. So you've got Beach Drive on one side to the south, and you've got Beach Drive to the north. And is it worth saving? And I'll leave that with that question. Thank you.